when we remember Brighton and its abattoirs, and also it just was known to all of us. That was where they brought the cattle to be slaughtered. And then, by golly, they also brought them to be housed there and to be sold there. So you can imagine. I said, that's going to be an interesting talk. Tonight, we have with us, and I'm going to read about a very little bit about him. Our guest speaker is Dr. William P. Marchione, and Dr. Marchione is president of the Brighton Allston Historical Society, and he's also a member of the Boston Landmarks Commission, and he's also teaches American history at the Massachusetts Bay Community College. We're glad you're here.
Well, thank you very much.
Good. You're on.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Penny. It's a pleasure to be with you this evening. I gave this talk initially, as Penny mentioned, at a conference at Regis College in October of 2002. And the official title that I gave to the presentation was To Market, the Impact of Cattle Drives Upon the Roads and Villages of Early 19th Century New England. They called me and they asked me to do a talk on some aspect of transportation. And as soon as I heard transportation mentioned, I'd been thinking about this topic, the impact of cattle drives on transportation. It just seemed like a natural topic to take up. Do you want to get the machine, Dave? My topic, the impact of cattle drives on the roads and villages of New England, is one that has received little attention from historians over the years, but it's a topic that's full of interest and that helps to remind us how completely the landscape of New England was dominated by agricultural pursuits in the early 19th century. Agriculture was the predominant economic activity and farming the predominant occupation just about everywhere in the United States in our early history. But here in New England, where planting suffered under the twin burdens of a shorter growing season and somewhat less fertile soil than elsewhere, the raising of livestock assumed a relatively greater importance. Many of the settlers who established themselves here in New England in the early colonial period had considerable experience in cattle raising. In England, these farmers had made a profitable business of bringing in cattle from distant points, fattening it, and providing it, along with other varieties of livestock, to drovers and butchers for sale to market towns. And given New England's agricultural disadvantages, they replicated these practices here. The emergence of an active and important New England cattle trade was an almost instantaneous development. As early as 1634, only 4 years after the foundation of the Bay Colony, Massachusetts already contained 1,500 head of cattle, 4,000 goats, and innumerable swine. Cattle was thus a key commodity in the New England region virtually from its inception. The growth of the industry was, as I've said, very quick. Apart from the salt hay of the region's coastal tidal marshes, New England had little natural fodder, so English grasses were quickly imported. The cultivation of these imported grasses spread rapidly, allowing the livestock population to multiply and flourish. Cattle not only provided a valuable article of trade and an important medium of exchange, but also a source of meat, dairy products, and animal byproducts. Moreover, livestock produced fertilizer, which local farmers used to enrich the region's soil and thereby increase New England's agricultural productivity. The importance of livestock to the economy of New England is reflected also in the extraordinary measures taken by local and colonial authorities to protect the herds from predators, including the Indians, during periods of warfare. The towns of New England employed cowherds, shepherds, goat herds, and swine herds to care for their cattle. In 1635, for example, Cambridge signed a contract with one Richard Rice to keep 100 cows. It was Rice's responsibility to, quote, fetch the cows into the town every morning out of the common, half an hour after the sun is up, at the farthest, and to bring them into the town half an hour before the sun goeth down, and to pay 3 pence a cow for every night he leaveth out any, end quote. Unattended livestock frequently did damage to fields and gardens, so each town established a pound for the confinement of loose animals, with the owner required to pay a fine and to compensate those whose property had been damaged. Property owners were deemed partly responsible and likewise subject to fines if their walls and fences were not properly maintained. Disputes stemming from damage to crops and property by loose livestock was a frequent source of litigation in the courts of the day. It's well to remember that the livestock population of New England exceeded that of human beings for many, many generations. Today, of course, a cow is an unusual sight. Back then, it was a rare landscape that did not include livestock of one kind or another. In his Commonwealth History of Massachusetts, Albert Bushnell Hart notes that cattle and sheep were being imported into the colony from Virginia and England throughout the 1600s, and that by the end of the century, most of the towns in the vicinity of Boston contained herds that were substantially larger than their human populations. In Rumney Marsh, now called Chelsea, for example, 32 farms contained 344 head of cattle and 1,544 sheep. A 1647 Cambridge inventory shows that that town, the seat of Harvard College, with about 500 residents, was home to 732 head of livestock. In more distant and rural locales such as Ipswich and Newbury, flocks of 1,000 sheep and more existed. Nor did the importance of livestock diminish over the course of the next several generations. So important was cattle to the economy of the region, and so relatively plentiful at the time of the American Revolution, that the town of Marlborough, Massachusetts, offered Continental Army recruits payment in steers rather than in coin. A February 12, 1781 Marlborough Town Ordinance offered 20 steers for a 3-year enlistment, 4 at the time of joining up, the rest upon completion of service. Medfield, Massachusetts offers another example of the plenitude of livestock. As late as 1784, a century and a half after the Bay Colony's foundation, that town of 800 residents contained a livestock population, cows, steers, oxen, horses, sheep, and swine, totaling 1,855 head. Reference has already been made to the use of marsh grasses of the tidal rivers as fodder for livestock. A plentiful supply of marsh grasses existed in Brighton, a part of Cambridge, until 1807, along the margin of the tidal Charles River. Here we see men gathering these grasses in North Brighton as late as the 1870s. In the early years of Cambridge's history, a major part of the town's herd was grazed on the relatively unpopulated south side of the Charles River at the southern end of the so-called Great Bridge. Until 1784, that was the only bridge on the tidal Charles. The cattle were brought to land now occupied by Harvard Stadium and the Harvard School of Business Administration. The great port city of Boston relied on such towns as Cambridge, Roxbury, Dorchester, Muddy River, the original name of Brookline, Newton, and Waltham for meat and dairy products. The most important cattle center in New England arose during the Revolution in the part of Cambridge that in 1807 became the town of Brighton. The awareness of the significance of Brighton as a center of the cattle trade has, unfortunately, faded from memory. But in the first 3/4 of the 19th century, the Brighton cattle market was a great New England institution. An August 1857 article in Harper's Weekly noted of the Brighton cattle market, quote, "Paris boasts its bourse, the Leviathan stock market of France, Venice its Rialto, the famed high change of southern Europe. The market days of London are as noted as are the November fogs of that huge metropolis, and Cattle Day at Brighton, Massachusetts, has long since, by universal assent, passed into an institution of New England." The Brighton cattle market was founded in the early months of the American Revolution when Jonathan Winship, the first and second, father and son, put out a call to the farmers of Middlesex County, urging them to send their cattle on the hoof and other livestock to the village of Little Cambridge, as Brighton Center was then known, to help provision General Washington's army headquartered across the Charles River in Cambridge proper. The British were cooped up in Boston, and the Army of New England, which was laying siege to the British forces, was in desperate need of provisions of all kinds, especially cattle, oxen, and horses. The enterprising Winships sought and were eventually granted contracts from the U.S. government to supply meat and draft animals for the Army. The importance of their contribution to the Patriot cause was noted by William M. Wallace in his Military History of the American Revolution. Quote, "If a soldier's stomach is kept full," wrote Wallace, "he can stand privation in other respects with a reasonable degree of cheerfulness." There were so few really hungry soldiers in the siege lines around Boston that winter that one might say that it was with food rather than with troops and arms that Washington kept the British locked up in the city, end quote. And the Winship enterprise continued to prosper from government contracts even after the British evacuation. In 1777, as the records of the Army of New England indicate, the family's 2 warehouses in Little Cambridge contained some 500 barrels of salted beef. So important was this meat supply deemed that the Army posted soldiers to protect it against possible sabotage. In 1780, Jonathan Winship II built an elaborate residence at the eastern end of the village, seen here, a short distance from the stockyard. Quote, "This Winship mansion," one source notes, "was in its day a house of much importance and was surrounded by a large tract of highly cultivated land, besides rich, well-stocked pastures on which browsed many varieties of fancy cattle." The first stockyard in Brighton was laid out next to the Bull's Head Tavern, seen here, an inn that stood on the road to Boston, a quarter-mile east of Brighton Center. The Winships also butchered cattle in a large slaughterhouse a few hundred yards away. The cattle and slaughtering trades quickly transformed the sleepy agricultural village of Little Cambridge into a thriving commercial center. The trading and butchering of cattle became the economic mainstay of the town for more than a century, profoundly influencing virtually every aspect of its economic, political, and social development. By 1790, Jonathan II, the elder Jonathan died in 1784, but Jonathan II, by 1790, was the largest meat packer in Massachusetts, putting up some 5,000 barrels of beef a year for foreign markets alone. Other slaughterhouses soon made their appearance. Thus was laid the foundation of the town's other great industry, meat packing. Here we see one of these slaughterhouses, possibly the one that was later owned and operated by Gustavus Franklin Swift, the founder of the Swift Meatpacking Company. By the mid-1860s, the high point of the industry in Brighton, there were 41 slaughterhouses scattered over the face of the town. So important did Brighton become as a center of the livestock trade that in 1816, the Massachusetts Society for Promoting Agriculture established an annual fair in the town, the so-called Brighton Fair and Cattle Show. This was the first regular fair in Massachusetts. In 1818, the MSPA built a permanent exhibition hall in Brighton atop Agricultural Hill on the south side of Brighton Center. This building still stands, having been moved from its original location, and is the oldest surviving building in Brighton Center. Every October from 1816 to the late 1830s, thousands of New Englanders converged on the Brighton Fair and Cattle Show, a major event of the period. Now, why did Brighton flourish as a cattle center? Well, geography provides the answer. Brighton Center lay astride the main road, now called Washington Street, linking Boston to its western hinterland. The Brighton stockyards lay less than 8 miles from the center of Boston, from the wholesale outlets for beef and other meats at the Faneuil Hall Market. It was therefore a logical collection point for livestock. The success of the cattle and slaughtering trades was reinforced by other major events of the early 19th century. First, in 1807, Brighton separated from Cambridge, placing local government firmly in the hands of the cattle and slaughtering interests who catered to the industry's needs. And then, in 1834, a railroad was constructed through the town, the Boston and Worcester Railroad, which was to have a profound impact on the trade, eventuating in a significant reduction in the number of cattle driven overland to Brighton, because at this point they began to utilize the railroad to transport the cattle. The Brighton cattle market was relocated and expanded in 1830, moving from its original location adjacent to the Bull's Head Tavern to a more central location behind the newly constructed Cattle Fair Hotel in Brighton Center. The first manager of the hotel was Zachariah B. Porter, who later ran Cambridge's Porterhouse Hotel, the man for whom Porter Square and the Porterhouse Steak were named. As one account of the Cattle Fair Hotel notes, quote, "From its first days as a hostelry, money poured into the coffers of the proprietor like water, and it was not a losing venture until the cattle industry in Brighton began to wane," end quote. In 1852, the Cattle Fair Hotel was magnificently enlarged in the Italianate style by noted Boston architect William Washburn. Its 100 rooms, dining room capable of accommodating 500 guests, and huge ballroom featuring a dance floor suspended on springs, made it the largest and most opulent hotel in the Boston suburbs, outclassing by far the 20 or so other hotels established in Brighton in the course of the 19th century, chiefly to accommodate the patrons of the town's burgeoning cattle and slaughtering trades. It was asserted in 1857, quote, that many celebrities visited the far-famed hostelry, and no sport of high degree from out of town considered a trip to Boston complete without a dinner at the Cattle Fair Hotel. Notable visitors included Senators Daniel Webster and Henry Clay. Henry Clay was said to have recognized cattle from his estate in the bluegrass region of Kentucky being offered for sale at the Brighton cattle market. Somehow I doubt the truth of that assertion, but it was made nonetheless. The Brighton stockyards comprised some 9 acres of livestock pens and barns stretching several hundred feet from the main highway, that is Washington Street. Just to the west of the stockyards was a residential district. Oakland Street passes through the center of this neighborhood, if you have any knowledge of Brighton, where many of the town's leading cattle dealers lived. Here we see the home of one of these men, William Monroe. Now, Brighton's town auctioneer, standing atop a raised platform, officiated over the weekly cattle market as thousands of head of livestock were sold to the highest bidder. In 1828, the New England Farmer estimated the value of cattle sold at Brighton, principally for slaughter, over less than 2 months at $540,000, an immense sum at that time. The sale of livestock at Brighton, in fact, averaged $2 million a year between 1831 and 40. Henry Coleman, in his 1841 report, of agriculture in Massachusetts provided the following impressive average annual sale figures for the 10-year period. Cattle totaled 49,500 head, sheep 97,794, and swine 22,700. So as you can well imagine, the roadways leading to Brighton were crowded with livestock. Coleman went on to note, quote, "The cattle principally consist of young stock for wintering, working oxen, milch cows with their calves, and fat cattle for barreling and for the retail market in the city and vicinity," end quote. Nor was this a strictly one-way traffic. Butchers from the small and remote villages and towns outside of Boston drove cattle purchased at Brighton back to their respective homes to be slaughtered. Large numbers of livestock were purchased by butchers along the route to supply industrial centers, such as Lowell, New Bedford, Fall River, and Providence, Rhode Island. According to the 1841 Coleman report, quote, "The number of head of cattle of all descriptions brought to Brighton frequently exceeds 8,000 on market day," and the market days were held once a week. Another important feature of Brighton as a livestock center was its famous, some would claim infamous, horse market, which stood directly across the highway from the Cattle Fair Hotel. A contemporary source describes the Brighton horse market in these colorful terms. Quote, "Horse traders, horse owners, jockeys, and good judges of horse flesh generally would flock to Brighton on the eve of each Wednesday, prepared to purchase the best the market afforded on the morrow. On Wednesday, all roads led to Brighton, and the auctioneer had no time to waste on the good and the bad points of this or that animal, but hurriedly made his stereotyped and monotonous little argument, and then the bidding would begin. There was always a steady stream of equines passing in and out of the two large entrances, and by the auctioneer's stand to be purchased and handled by eager buyers and mischievous boys, and then passing out again almost before a bystander not familiar with horseflesh had determined the animal's color," end quote. The great writer Nathaniel Hawthorne, who visited Brighton several times while a resident of Brook Farm in West Roxbury, put it best. Quote, "A Brighton horse," he wrote, "has become a proverb. Here are gathered all the old, worn out, broken down, and used up omnibus, cart, and livery stable steeds. And these are knocked down, if they don't tumble down, at sums varying from $5 to $40. These sales are productive of a great deal of merriment, and the mettle, speed, and fine points of the animals are exhibited, the points perhaps being sufficiently prominent already." Hawthorne is referring here to the bones protruding from these scrawny animals. End quote. Herds of livestock converged on Brighton from every direction, from Rhode Island, Cape Cod, Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, even eastern Canada. According to the 1857 Harper's Weekly description of the Brighton cattle market, thousands of cattle, fat and lean, immense flocks of sheep, good and bad, myriads of porkers, large and small, and hundreds of horses, indifferent or miserable, passed here finally every year from the hands of those who raise the stock or who forestall the purchase of it in quantities into the possession of the dealers of smaller caliber, which in turn job the animals in pairs or dozens to the retailer or fit them for the shambles. As early as the 1820s, the Brighton cattle market was receiving between 2,000 and 8,000 head of cattle every Monday, with the traffic on the roads to the market town assuming such proportions that the clergymen of the country villages through which they passed complained of, quote, "the noise and confusion of the autumnal Sabbath in Middlesex, the lowing of herds, the bleating of flocks, the resounding lash, and the drover's voice and whistle discordantly mingled with the songs of the temple." A Brookline historian has written, quote, "It was a common sight to see the herds of cattle and occasionally of sheep, and this is the first church in Brookline, driven through Brookline Village and up Washington Street to Brighton. Starting down in Rhode Island with a few head, cattle were mixed up from farmers along the road, were picked up rather, from farmers along the road so that the herd was at its maximum through Brookline. Hawthorne described the countryside between West Roxbury and Brighton as a district of, quote, warm and comfortable farmhouses and modern cottages, smart and tasteful, and variegated scenery, including pleasant groves of oak and elm, but also took note of the many people with cows, oxen, sheep, and pigs. It's little wonder that the residents of suburban communities like Brookline found livestock herding so objectionable. Hawthorne was traveling in this instance by wagon and with a single calf in tow. Most of the drovers and cattlemen who converged on the weekly Brighton cattle market traveled much greater distances and drove many more head of livestock. Detailed descriptions of these drives are hard to come by. The few that exist are the more to be valued on that account. One writer tells us that in the 1850s, it took his grandfather, a Vermont farmer and cattle raiser, a full month to drive his herd to the Brighton market. The pace was leisurely, the writer explained, because this farmer engaged in multiple business transactions along the road and also made frequent stops along the way to allow his cattle to graze. His grandfather, the author recounted, would set out one morning before sunup with a dozen cattle and a couple of helpers. The helpers walked up front and Grandpa followed, riding or walking his horse. 3 men and a dozen animals. Didn't look too efficient, but Grandpa always counted on picking up a load on the way. Mayhew, over to Bellows Falls, generally had another dozen. So did Bartlett at Keene, and Eaton down to Fitchburg. They'd see Grandpa coming and stop what they were doing in the fields and come down to the gate for a talk. First, they'd exchange what news they had, who'd been born or died since the last trip, and who'd got married, and how seemed like there was more rain or less this year than anyone in these parts could remember. Then Mayhew'd say, buying or selling? And Grandpa'd say, both, trading too. And Mayhew would look at our stock, and Grandpa would look at his. And Mayhew'd talk like he hadn't ought to sell, and Grandpa'd say prices down to Brighton were so low he hadn't ought to buy. Sometimes the talk would go on all afternoon, and Grandpa would help drive his stock into Mayhew's pasture, and he'd give him supper, and then they'd spend the night in the barn. There was never much hurry. Mayhew would come to the barn just when everyone was getting ready for bed to say that if he did decide to sell, what would Grandpa pay? Of course, they traded by the animal, not by the pound in those days, and the bargaining kept up till they agreed on a price. By the middle of the trip, this account tells us Grandpa Putnam would have accumulated 150 to 200 head. And all hands would be kept busy keeping the cattle moving and on the road. Every second or third day they'd stop for perhaps a half day to graze the herd, and Grandpa Putnam would know well before reaching Brighton if the market was favorable. If so, buyers would meet him along the road, perhaps 5 to 10 miles outside of Brighton, to buy up his stock. If the market was favorable, a trade was made, and another, and another, and after a while Grandpa had his leather pouch full of money and nothing left but his horse. He'd sell that too if he got a good price. Then, arriving in Brighton, if it was before bank closing time, he'd go over to the bank, which stood opposite the cattle market, shake out the silver dollars on the counter, and trust the bank to put the right amount on the books. Brighton, incidentally, as an important market town, was one of the first communities outside of Boston to establish a bank. It's being founded in 1830, primarily for the convenience of the cattle dealers. What we see here is a $50 note issued by the Bank of Brighton in 1850, its central motif being, of course, a herd of cattle arriving in Brighton. Another eyewitness account of cattle drives to Brighton comes from a gentleman named Wentworth, also recounting the experience of a grandparent and his brothers, a family named Ames. The Ameses came down from Parsonfield, Maine, close by the New Hampshire boundary, 110 miles from Brighton. They typically made 2 trips a year, one soon after haying, the other between Thanksgiving and Christmas. This account establishes a number of interesting facts about these cattle drives. First of all, the trip was 110 miles, and it typically took 7 or 8 days to complete. Stops for rest and grazing of cattle were made, whenever possible, at the farmsteads of relatives, thus allowing for family visits as well as business transactions. When family stopovers weren't possible, drovers utilized the fields of farmers who made a business of servicing passing herds. They charged a fee for each head of cattle accommodated in this fashion. 50 cents per head was the price in the late 1860s. The owners also benefited, incidentally, from the enriching effects of the manure that the cattle deposited on their land. The cattle dealers often turned in their herds by noontime, especially if they thought there might be an opportunity to trade in a given locale. As we've already noted, drovers were skilled swappers. The cattle would feed during the afternoon and night and would be turned back into the roadway at the crack of dawn. Thus, livestock made the trip to Brighton without excessive loss of weight. And finally, the Wentworth account indicates that some livestock was sold on its way to Brighton. The least desirable animals were usually disposed of along the way. Those arriving in Brighton were the animals of better quality, as a rule. Thus, herds crowded the main roads of New England, slowing down traffic. The drovers tended to utilize the main thoroughfares, which created problems for through travelers, whether on foot, horseback, in private conveyances, or stagecoaches. Landscape historian John R. Stilgo, who teaches at Harvard, tells us that even good roads allowed cattle to travel no more than 9 miles a day. And if they were especially well fattened, they moved about 7, while herds of cattle mixed with hogs moved at the rate of only about 5 miles a day. Drovers were particularly dependent upon bridges, since every fording took time, and time, of course, cost money. Also, on better and straighter roads, livestock lost less weight than on poorly maintained and circuitous byways. The 1841 Coleman report tells us that, quote, the cost of droving neat cattle to Brighton from points 100 miles away was $2 per head, plus the loss of about 100 pounds in weight. 100 pounds being but a fraction of the weight of these cattle. Upon arriving at Brighton, a steer might weigh 1,500 pounds, an oxen 2,800 pounds to 3,000 pounds, an ox. Thus, in the period before the introduction of rail transport, the principal roads of New England, the main coaching roads, were also crowded with livestock. The drovers and cattle dealers who tended these slow-moving herds needed to turn in from time to time. They also needed food and water, not only for themselves, of course, but for their charges. Certain of the inns and taverns along the main coaching roads equipped themselves accordingly. Little Cambridge's Bull's Head Tavern, situated on the road to Boston, was one such establishment and had furnished this service to drovers long before the Winships chose the tavern as a collection point for the Little Cambridge stockyards. The tavern had existed since the beginning of the 18th century. Its very name suggests, the Bull's Head Tavern, the function it performed as a terminus for livestock. The Bull's Head Tavern enjoyed certain natural advantages. It was, as previously noted, on the main road to Boston, only 8 miles from the city, but additionally, across the roadway from the tavern was situated a broad piece of flat land through the center of which ran a brook, an ideal location for a livestock enclosure. Another example of a tavern that catered to drovers was the Buckman Tavern in Lexington, Massachusetts. One commentator has written of this tavern, quote, "In addition to the wagon loads of produce, droves of cattle, sheep, and hogs, and flocks of turkeys used the highways and were kept overnight in the tavern yards or someplace nearby," end quote. Another location that maintained facilities for drovers was the town of Medford. As one Medford historian notes, quote, "For more than 100 years, all the land travel to Boston from Maine, from the eastern part of New Hampshire and the northeastern part of Massachusetts, passed through Medford, and its distance from Boston made it a convenient stopping place for traveling traders. Hence the need of public houses. No town in the state of its size had so many in number or better in quality, and they were all placed conveniently on the great thoroughfare, that is to say, the New Hampshire-Vermont Road." There was a significant improvement in New England's transportation after 1790 as turnpikes began to be built outside of Boston and older thoroughfares were improved. An important point should be made here. Whatever the hazards and inconveniences associated with cattle drives, they furnished an important source of income for many New Englanders. The drovers who herded the cattle to market, the farmers who accommodated man and beast along the roads, and the tavern keepers in the more settled regions whose hostelries derived important income from this trade in livestock. The improved transportation system that developed in New England after 1790 did not have the transforming effect upon the cattle trade that the railroads were later to have. These new, better built, and more direct transportation corridors facilitated the overland trade. The most elaborate of these thoroughfares, the turnpikes, rarely successful from an economic standpoint, were more than happy to have the patronage of the drovers and their charges, as becomes clear from an examination of the fee schedules that were established by the turnpikes. The Worcester Turnpike, for example, completed in 1806, established charges as follows. A cart or wagon drawn by a single horse paid 6.5 cents. A man on horseback, 4 cents. A sleigh or sled drawn by 2 oxen or horses, 8 cents, and another cent for each additional draft animal. And with regard to herds, for each horse, mule, or head of neat cattle on the roadway, 1 cent was charged, with swine or sheep charged at the rate of 3 cents to the dozen. The Newbury Turnpike, also known as the Straight Road, which opened 2 years before the Worcester Turnpike, charged somewhat higher tolls. A 1-horse chaise was charged 10 cents as opposed to 6.5 on the Worcester Road. But the charge for livestock was identical, 1 cent for a steer, with sheep and swine costing 3 cents to the dozen. There was a price to be paid, of course, for the presence of large numbers of quadrupeds on the roadways of New England. The herds were an obstacle, slowing down those traveling by stagecoach and horse-drawn conveyances. On the other hand, the turnpikes did not typically pass through the centers of villages. Herding was particularly objectionable on the Sabbath, which prompted the New England legislature to adopt laws forbidding the movement of livestock on the biblical day of rest. The most important roadways linking the Brighton cattle market and nearby Boston to the livestock supply of the region were 6. The heavily traveled Worcester-Springfield Road, a turnpike in its more easterly section after 1806, was perhaps the most important of these roadways, in that it linked the rich grazing land of the central Connecticut River Valley to Brighton. The Straight Road, referred to earlier, which gave access from the north. This was really a combination of the Newbury Road out of Essex County and the New Hampshire-Vermont Road running southeast out of the Green Mountains of Vermont. The Hartford and Providence roads gave the southerly part of the fertile Connecticut River Valley and the rich grazing region that enclosed Rhode Island and Rhode Island's Narragansett Bay access to Brighton. And finally, the Plymouth Cape Cod Road, along which the young drover and cattle dealer Gustavus Franklin Swift of Cape Cod's Eastham herded his cattle to Brighton in the 1850s. All of the settled areas through which the cattle were herded, of course, paid a price of inconvenience and potential property damage. The approaches from the north across the Charles River posed particular problems. By 1825, there were 5 bridges linking Brighton to its neighbors north of the Charles. The story is recounted of a woman who, while crossing the North Harvard Street Bridge, a wooden drawbridge on the line of today's Anderson Bridge, found herself confronted by a herd of rampaging cattle approaching from the Cambridge side of the river. With the certainty of otherwise being trampled to death, she flung herself over the bridge's wooden railings, holding on for dear life while the herd passed over into Brighton, then clambered back onto the footpath with no small loss of dignity, as you can well imagine. No community paid a higher price in the disruption of its day-to-day activities than did Brighton itself. For many years, Brighton was the only town in Massachusetts that operated its public schools on a Tuesday through Saturday schedule, Monday being cattle market day. And that day was deemed just too dangerous for the children of the town to be traversing the streets. Then in the 1830s, market day was shifted to Thursday, with the schools thereafter closing on that day. Rampaging cattle continued to be a problem for the town well into the 20th century, with the local police force jokingly referred to as the cowboy cops, because they were so often called upon to capture or shoot cattle that had gotten loose from the Brighton stockyards. The inconveniences Brighton suffered from its association with the cattle and related slaughtering trades were formidable. Thousands of head of livestock were, of course, regularly driven over the roadways of the market town each week, generating noise, dust, property damage, and subjecting passers-by to the possibility of serious physical injury. The livestock trade also attracted a rowdy element that often drove their horse-drawn vehicles through the streets of the town with little regard for public safety, as this slide illustrates. And then there were the moral hazards. Each week, hundreds of dealers and drovers had to be accommodated in the town's many hotels, where heavy drinking, carousing, gambling, theft, pickpocketry, and prostitution were commonplace. Brighton was a rough and tumble town in this period. In addition, Brighton's noxious industries polluted its air and water. The offal from its slaughterhouses, which polluted the town's watercourses, and the manufactories turning out such animal byproducts as leather, buttons, corset stays, blinds, whips, lampblack, and bone fertilizer, emitted foul odors and bacteria, which made the market town the primary suburban candidate for periodic outbreaks of epidemic disease. By the 1860s, Brighton's mortality rate was the highest in the Boston suburbs. On the other hand, of course, the cattle and slaughtering trades were the engine of the local economy. The town's cattle dealers and slaughterhouse proprietors possessed much of its wealth and dominated local government. The foundation of sizable fortunes were being laid in Brighton in these years. One Brighton slaughterhouse proprietor, as already noted, was Gustavus Franklin Swift, who left for Chicago in the early 1870s, where he founded the Swift Meatpacking Company. His business partner, James Ambrose Hathaway, who remained in Brighton, specializing in the export of beef to Europe, also flourished, as we can see from the scale of his imposing mansion on Brighton's Chestnut Hill Avenue. While the coming of the railroad did not totally eliminate overland cattle drives, there would be a shift after 1840 to greater and greater dependence on rail transport to reach the Brighton cattle market. And so, gradually but inexorably, the day of the romantic, noisome, and inconvenient overland cattle trade receded into history. Thank you very much. And I'd be happy to answer any questions if there are any.
Any questions?
Shut this. You. Well, in 1872, the legislature mandated the closing of the slaughterhouses, and slaughtering activities from that point on were carried out at the Brighton Abattoir, which was a modern slaughtering facility. It was actually 14 slaughterhouses under one roof, and it operated on the most advanced principles. The French were in the leadership in the area of slaughtering in that period, and thus the word abattoir, the French word for slaughterhouse, was applied to this. And it continued to operate into the 1950s.
Most of the cattle came from the local area.
Well, the cattle came from quite distant points, as far away as eastern Canada. So they were
How about south?
certainly Cape Cod, Rhode Island, Connecticut.
Nothing from Texas.
By rail at a later date, certainly steer were brought in from Texas. But what happens, you see, in the 1870s is there's a shift in the technology to refrigerated railroad cars, and when that happens, most of the slaughtering from that point on is going to be carried out in the West, closer to the source of supply, and then the slaughtered cattle will be shipped in refrigerated cars to the eastern markets. And that marks a decline in the business in Brighton. What the slaughterhouse in Brighton in later years tended to cater to the kosher meat trade, where there's a religious requirement that the meat be consumed within 48 hours of the slaughtering, so it needed to be slaughtered
So
locally.
you're talking about a 30-year period or something like that? Maybe?
For what?
For when the cattle were first put up in this area and then taken over by, the railroads and so forth.
Well, the cattle trade in Brighton goes back to 1775. And the industry, I would suggest, began to decline with the introduction of refrigerated railroad cars in the 1870s. So you have a century there. And then it didn't completely go out of existence, of course, until later.
We thank you very much. You can see why I was really determined. Very good. We hope that you'll remember that next month we're going to have a visitor. And that visitor is going to be Mrs. John Hancock. Dorothy Quincy Hancock will be with us next month, and so we hope that you will be with us too. Be sure and stay for refreshments.
What's your time?
She takes the part of Mrs. John Hancock.
Great. So we know.